Oh yeah. Hey there, hi there, ho there. This and that today. Fortunately, I didn't have to serve on a jury this morning, so that's all good. Other than my inability to read legalese, that was my other problem this morning. But at least I was sufficiently awake enough to have my parking validated. But anyway, commodity form and law. Um, Today, this and that. Generally, what I've been uh, fiddling around with and the things that I fiddle around with is a certain idea that, well, it's unclear, and I probably should learn Russian, but um, there is a concept of uh, of law that existed during the Stalinist period, or just before the Stalinist period. You could say actually that it was a development of the original idea of the revolution, the pre-Stalinist Russian Soviet government. So law in the Soviet context was very some could compare it to sort of Kardashian law. That is that you're guilty and it's pretty much a formality. Um, the only adjustments probably occur in punishment. So if you've made it all the way to court, there's very little possibility of your being freed. And as we've seen with the punishment of dissenters in Russia currently, um, they pretty much do the same damn thing. So other arrangements must be made, like the recent hostage freeing was clearly about not about law, but it was pretext to hold people hostage in an international sense. Now that's that's the current conception of kind of law that is formerly Soviet and currently Russian. Similarly, developments in the People's Republic of China have gone through the same sort of thing. For many years, it was a kind of Stalinist law. That is, that if you got that far, that is, you were going to court and whatever. Punishment was pretty much the type of punishment was pretty much the variable. Wasn't It was going to be difficult to have you be freed. Let's see, there was a Richard Gere movie, uh, the, an example of a repressive uh, Chinese law. But anyway, not that we care about these matters, as I scare people away. Pashakanis, Yevgeny Pashakanis, is probably the foremost academic in terms of pre-Stalinist Soviet law. Now, you may not think that that's important, but because of these little things I've been fiddling around with, it's pretty clear that he tries to be pretty rigorous about applying Marx and Lenin to the legal theory and the formation of the Soviet state. And so that's all good. I mean, in that sense, it's a kind of a perfect fit. And one example of that is in Pashakanis's book on the so-called general theory of law. And uh, needless to say, as by mentioning it, it's a pre-Stalinist thing. Pashakanis gets accused of being a Trotskyite and gets purged, poor bastard. But we at least have his texts that are still possible. So commodity form theory allows us to more materially understand the underlying political economic forces underpinning law. And so looking at the kind of social relations question for legislation and legal interpretation, it's kind of important to see how that works. And it is still important to sort of look at. And then as you can see, Monthly Review is interested in it because it does have a kind of orthodox kind of position. But it's also useful to consider its relationship to other kinds of, for example, real American law, European influences like the Frankfurt School and legal philosophy, and its influence on the 1970s movement called critical legal studies, which is still used, still studied in law schools, but it has evolved into the sort of law and LPE, the law and political economy sort of movement. But needless to say, it has offshoots, and the recent attack on critical legal studies or its vestiges is in the form of critical race theory that it's been demonized by the right wing. So you can see in this diagram race and law. There's a feminist component as well, but not as well supported, needless to say, for all the usual reasons. Postmodernism, there is a postmodern kind of trend in law, but less so in the United States, slightly more so in from an Anglo-American point of view in England. And then, of course, economic law theory, which is, you could say, is the kind of thing that is a heterodox approach to it, but that's where law and political economy currently is. And it's not about so much the market driving law as it is trying to look at institutional features of that. So it is a continuing challenge. Now, what is it? What is a commodity form? It's sort of to survive in a world, and this is Marx from volume 1 of Capital, is that you can survive only by selling your capacity to work to the class that controls the means of producing commodities. So it's simply this, your labor power, et cetera, is a commodity in this particular context. So following that further is that law itself is a kind of commodity, because this is the question of these social relations, that is one's position, you could say a class position. And Kashikanis is important because he had this sort of a well fit, I suppose. I mean, he was a strict kind of dialectical materialist in the sense that the expectation was that the current state of capitalism, that is capitalism as it existed outside the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s, was a mere, as we've talked about before, was a transition to socialism and ultimately communism. So studying law in that particular context was important to see the commodity, this idea of commodities, and you had to sort of deal with it. And it wasn't so much as surrendering to it or surrendering to capitalism, which is what he was being accused of when they accused him of being a Trotskyite. But actually, he was seeing in this larger historical model that, and you could argue that he wasn't really fulfilling all the the socialism in one country, blah 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 blah. But needless to say, a lot of people got purged, and denunciations occur all over the place. So that's how you spell his name, Evgeny Pashikanis. And you can see this is a 2017 article, sort of that this is still on people's minds. So whether one believes that law is provided by God, that is natural law, is created by human intellect, that's positivism in a philosophical sense, a gendered institution perpetuating patriarchy, and that's clearly what the feminist position on this, or the maintainer of the status quo against marginalized groups, critical legal studies. Undergirding those beliefs is the assumption that law is autonomous. That's actually a big idea about whether it sits as, like John Roberts on the Supreme Court says, "Oh, I'm just an umpire." Well, that's just bullshit. But it's not that idea of autonomy and neutrality is sort of we know that that's just BS. Undergirding those beliefs is the assumption that law is autonomous. In its autonomy, law operates as an impartial arbiter of right. Recall that right is the thing that we were talking about relative to Hegel and Marx, the philosophy of right, about sort of position of law relative to the state or to hierarchies. Law sustains society through universal regulation. Law is considered autonomous because it is considered to have a quote unquote mind logic of its own. There's a certain kind of formalism built in there as well. However, for Pashakanis and commodity form theorists such as Isaac B. Balbus and Shina Nievi, same guy who Kelly was mentioning relative to weaponized architecture, among other things, law slaves for capitalism. The state as an organization of class domination and as an organization for the conduct of external wars does not require legal interpretation and in essence doesn't allow it. Authority is the guarantor of market exchange, not only may be expressed in terms of law, but itself appears as law and only law and is merged entirely with the abstract objective norm. Therefore, every juridic theory of the state which wishes to embrace all the functions of the latter necessarily appears inadequate. It may be a true reflection of all facts of state life, but gives only an ideological, that is, a distorted reflection of reality. This is all, it's a very Leninist position. Under the conventional perspective of law, law is a grand judge sitting on a cloud deciding our fate. Sometimes law is a supernatural entity who knows more than we do. Sometimes law is just like us and makes mistakes and only knows as much as we do. Sometimes law is a man who only thinks like a man and is missing the intelligence of a woman. Sometimes law is a selected person from the ruling class who only knows to rule by class. In all of these scenarios, law is above the world and rules it without much input from the world. Commodity form theory argues that law is a product of capitalism and acts as a commodity for the exchange of political interests, that is, capitalist interests. Now, this is an interesting question of how autonomous is, law in this context, and as a commodity that affects everything, how autonomous can it be? So, Marx notes that out of all the commodities over time arises one commodity that can be used in exchange for all other commodities. This commodity, the universal commodity, whatever it is perceived by all others in society and eventually the world for whatever reason as equivalent in value, that is given a certain amount of it, to any other commodity. For example, gold may be used to purchase anything in the world because that gold can be taken and used to purchase anything else. We call this commodity the money commodity. So you see the same path is here. This is just, strict Marx. That is, you move to gold. You see that money, there is a money commodity form, and that it achieves a certain degree of universality. Due to the money commodity's exchangeability with all other commodities, it has universal appeal. That universal appeal is in relation to commodities. Commodities are economic products. Therefore, we say that the money commodity, that is money, is the universal economic equivalent of all other commodities. Now, this shorthand is, of course, problematic, as we've seen before. That is, Marx doesn't fully develop his money theory and hence leaves it open to a certain variety of interpretations, hence modern money theory. That's just a sketch of that. But just as money is the universal economic equivalent, law is the universal political equivalent. So the relation between law and economics is clear. Every econ department worth its salt does teach a law and economics type course because there is an entire body of literature of where law defends the capitalist system because of antitrust and a variety of other things, property law, etc. Pashakanis argues that law must run in relation to capital, that is, money circulating commercially to further commodity production. Money is a commodity, capital is money and used for the production of commodities with the ultimate aim of making more money and prime. Law arises as a means to the end of generating capital. So that's always, connection there. And you can see that in the legal profession, money is the measure. Just like Trump is now claims that he's going to sue the federal government for prosecuting, prosecutory violation. He wants damages. He wants like $150 million damages from the documents case, and it will be fascinating to see whether that's going to happen or not. But it's sort of, I mean, you had to expect it. I mean, he's got to cover his costs, and he's going to make a profit of it because he was using money from the PACs and the political campaign. So it's just a grift in that context, all aided by, the judges that he appoints. One hopes that will end in November. Unlike other perspectives of the law, which look to some form of social contract, commodity form theory views law's origin as a history birthed by commodity production. In the neoliberal state, the dominant political economy is capitalism. We know that as a result of colonialism, the world is under the capitalist regime. Thus, the laws of liberal or neoliberal states are products of capitalism. International law is a product of capitalism. And arguably, as the logic suggests, even countries which purport not to be capitalist due to the hegemony of capitalism globally have laws which, in their response to capitalism's reach, have been transmuted into products of capital. Law's authority does not therefore come from reason. That's probably pretty much all you have to know in terms of international settlements, currency exchange, all that other crap. That's the problem. Instead, law's authority comes from the capitalist class. Pashkanis goes as far as to posit that theories of the state after the practice of state making has already been developed as a way to rationalize the legitimacy of government. This is kind of how the Bolsheviks. Hence, what we know about law is always a posteriori. We sort of always know it after the fact. Under capitalism, the world inherently lives by ex post facto law after the fact. From this point of view, there is no material demarcation between the logic of capitalists and the logic of law. That is to say that the law is a mirror image, it's very Leninist, mirror image of capitalist rules. Law is law because it is universally applied. Every human interest in society is a political interest. Law is used to mediate interests. By having a capitalist logic, law inherently mediates along capitalist lines. It's why rather than get an MBA, people go into the law even with crummy law degrees because, there's money somewhere involved. And what better example of someone who manipulates the law than, Trump? Hence, the law on theft is interpreted along private property lines. That is a mechanism of capitalism. That's the most insidious component of it, of course, and not, for example, in the logic of Amerindians, that is, the indigenous people of the United States or North America, who had no concept of private property. If the law incorporated the logic of multiple social actors, the law of theft may incorporate a ban on the commodification of water, since Amerindians would have seen privatizing water as inherently against communal principles. Needless to say, that's not kind of where we are in the United States about water rights and riparian law. Other perspectives consider law to be law, and not just mere rules, because they believe it to be autonomous. What gives law its legal form is its autonomy. However, its law is indeed a byproduct of capitalism, can't be said to have an actual legal form. Commodity form theory argues that this thing called law has no legal form. Law is therefore a set of rules imposed upon the population through the violence of capital. The whole question of the violence of capital is underpins this, right? Exploitation, extraction of labor power, blah blah blah. All of those things is it's all in these kinds of what you could refer to as a commodity form, like a contract. The test commodity forms theory's argument that law is not only inextricably linked to capitalism, but a product of it. One may query whether the law would be different in character if capitalism never existed. This question appears to have an obvious answer, that being yes. One may argue that the question is silly, but it isn't. If law were truly autonomous, its character would transcend material paradigms. One may argue that law's equality component, that all people in law, that in law, all people in society are subject to the same law, makes law autonomous. But that argument from commodity forms theory's perspective is flawed. If the law states that all people in the country cannot eat in public, but there are those without private dwellings or the means to utilize private spaces such as restaurants for consuming food, then this equal application does not serve one and not the other. The person with means need not consider the law because he or she has access to private space. And unless you think that's unimportant, there are public space laws that have that kind of criterion, and it's weird, but that places apply these, and in some ways they're just sort of artifacts of feudalism. But anyway, under capitalism, law is equally applied to social relations, but its impact is unequal due to the economic advantages each person, household, and entity holds. Law, therefore, is equally inequitable by its very nature, which is actually an interesting way to phrase that. Law sits above capital only to reinforce capital. Laws are used in ways which reinforce the inequalities capitalism produces. And yes, indeed, that is. And legitimacy comes through the faux impartiality of law. If the product of impartial application is a partial outcome, the application itself is a hollow shell for bias. Therefore, capitalism is the base of what is considered law. Now, that seems somewhat tautological, but we're in the current mode of production called capitalism, and legal structures do exist. And Pashukanis, being concerned about the evolution of the new communist man, so to speak, the move to eventually have capitalism wither away and stuff, is trying to anticipate what will law wither away in the same way, because you don't need to have a certain kind of law, and in some ways it's kind of anarchist view of this in terms of self-governance. Another example of the masked inequity of law through faux autonomy to meet capitalist ends can be found in international law. This is actually the most interesting component of this. Under mercantilism, trade barriers were law. This is the Trumpian position in some ways. This was a time of colonialism when capitalists considered protecting domestic markets as a key to profit. As capital saturated domestic markets, capital needed to find new markets, and free trade was introduced. Free trade, quote unquote, was introduced at the time that colonies became independent states. The new states, who under mercantile capitalism would have had the space to develop via protectionism, were subjected to the new rule of free trade. The inequity of free trade law becomes apparent when one considers the reality that young markets lack the capital to fend off large influxes of capital competition into their markets. This is actually the North-South problem. The reality is apparent when one considers the destruction of Jamaica's milk industry and subsequent use of the International Monetary Fund's first structural adjustment program constructed by the USA, which would see much of the third world being forced into similar agreements. Note that TPP, NAFTA, et cetera, are all kind of artifacts of that kind of thing. Commodity form theory sees nothing autonomous about law. There's no legal form for law. That's not to say that law is not legal. To say that law is not legal is to suggest that there is an institution which forms standards which we can pull off. Instead, law is part of the superstructure, member-based superstructure, just like culture, education, and whatever else, responding to capitalism's needs. And then there's this notion of fetishism, and in some ways, this is the point, particularly from volume 1 of Capital, It's easy to find appeal in the idea that we're all equal under the law. This sense of equality makes humans believe that they relate to each other socially as equals. Darn democracy. In other words, if we are equal under law, we are equal politically. And note that that's not fairly well covered, or anyway, not fully achieved in the American experiment. Commodity form theory argues that the sense of social equality produced by legal equality produces a fetishistic fixation with law. Just like any other commodity, we become fixated with law because it appears to alleviate the power imbalance of economic inequality. The common person believes him or herself equal to any other person because he or she can bring a lawsuit against another. Very Trump-like. Any person can sue another, but a suit costs money. Without means, a suit is likely to get off the ground or get very far. If it does take, a suit is unlikely to get off the ground or get very far if it does take life. Generally, in the case of crime, the legal action belongs to the government, which may deny you the right you believe yourself to have. It, therefore, becomes quite difficult to say that law alleviates economic power imbalances. Bobus argues that it is the ignorance of the origins of commodities as human ideas that results in fetishism. That's actually an interesting and arguable point. It's the belief that law is a self-created phenomenon which precludes change upon the law in a manner that makes law reflective of the reality of inequity. Commodities are believed to have a life of their own, but in reality, they do not. They are but material spawns of mental copulation. I like that. Fetishism causes a common person to advocate for perpetuating a money system, even to their disadvantage, because equal access to money gives the illusion of social equality. The legal system is deified because it is believed to give a false sense of social security. However, one can have access to redress in order to secure property rights, but not the property upon which to make property claims. And this is a very, the commercial law has that peculiar problem built into. Often rights are legally real and socially fictitious. So you see, there's this kind of, there are divisions in capital that, create the inequalities, that it comes with the territory, let's put it that way. So there's a variety of literature that supports this, and there's a little history to this, and this shows in some ways how a little bit more rigorous legal scholars in the Soviet Union were to Marx, theories of Marx. And you could say that's, on the one hand, a good thing. On the other hand, it can rationalize some pretty horrible injustices if not properly regulated. So from 1924 to 1936, Peshakanus produced a number of works on Marxism and law. And it's amazing that he was, working on this problem. And the 1924 manuscript, General Theory of Law and Marxism, is pretty much his master work. And building it on laissez-faire premises is, that's still what Peshakanus didn't do, and we would assert simply because the literature wasn't available, is to take the origins of laissez-faire in the physiocrats, etc. He doesn't quite do that. He doesn't move the ball forward in that sense. But it draws inspiration from the first 100 pages of Marx's Capital, that is volume 1, where the fetishism of commodities is discussed. So Marx's position, of course, draws from Hegel. Peshakanus indicated that a homology existed between the development of the commodity and legal form. Homology is if you were talking about a things that are homologous have a generally corresponding form, that they're not identical, but they share features which would allow them to hold a certain kind of structure. And that this development occurred behind people's backs, regardless of class standing. So this is kind of, and I think a useful notion, that is this idea that stuff happens that aren't quite there and are not fully public. And in that sense, the public sphere is not fully served under this conception of law. Capital logic, Pashkanis contends, produces such abstractions such as the juridic subject, the reasonable man. This is this, seeking a kind of, average person or whatever subject under the law. And principles such as the due process clause, the equivalence principle, both articulated in the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, this is important, if only because the right wing in the United States would love to get rid of the entire 14th Amendment, which is fascinating to think of why they would want to do that. But it does mean that you're not constrained in protecting things like individual rights or due process or whatever. And underlying that, of course, is all the current right-wing stuff about, well, women don't need to have those rights. The state can determine, punishments in in a whole variety of forms, up to and including taking bounties on women who violate state borders, which is just absurd on its face. Capital logic was also to find its way into various slogans verbalized during revolutions around the world, which were subsequently given idealized expression in the various declarations of independence, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Let us summarize Pashkanis' theory as developed in his initial publication of 1924. And so there's this other article is on, how is it that we can build this kind of theory? And so, Pashkanis is talking about a certain concept about exchange, how things are and can be exchanged. And this follows in a pretty direct sense Marx in terms of use value and exchange value. And remember that Marx begins volume 1 with the concept of a commodity. The use value of a commodity can in turn be seen as incorporating two elements: an unequal amount of labor in its production and the unequal amount of benefit that it brings. So this is, the beginnings of thinking about a surplus. Use value, thus, incorporates differences. Whenever we produce for direct use, we have products and not commodities. In competitive capitalism, however, objects produced in exchange take on the form of commodities. And this is, and it comes because of exchange. And this is that whole point about how is it that we derive surplus value, but from exchange relations at scale. When two commodity owners meet at the marketplace to exchange commodities, the initial use value undergoes a change to an exchange value. Now that sounds like magic, but when it's described in a more historical context, it is about production at scale, production in space and time in that sense, and also consumption in space and time, which affects this exchange value, which as a function of this motion, you get surplus value. Exchange value reflects a ratio of exchange. This is how Marx goes about it. Remember all those little ratio things that he keeps working through. One commodity is exchanged with another in a specific quantitative ratio. 2 gallons of milk could be exchanged for 1 pound of butter. This is a mathematical relationship of equivalence. 2 gallons of milk, 1 pound of butter, inherent in the use value, are now replaced by a ratio of exchange. What began as a qualitative relationship, and that is inherent differences in the use value. That is, not so many of us drink butter or buttermilk, and some of us don't drink milk at all. Through commodity exchange translated into a quantitative relationship. Further, money becomes the universal equivalent. That is, $2 can purchase either 2 gallons of milk or 1 pound of butter. And so hence a masking has taken place. This is that whole sort of appearance and essence, kind of Hegelian idea, is that mystification is occurring. The memory of use value, Marx tells us, as distinct from exchange value, has become entirely extinguished in this incarnation of pure exchange value. What has disappeared from consciousness are the inherent differences, now replaced by their representative. I can't believe it's butter, or I can't believe it's not butter. Quality has been changed into quantity, substance into form, and money is now worshipped as the universal equivalent. This is the process of the fetishism of commodities. It's also known as the law of equivalence or capital logic, and it occurs behind people's backs. Now, this whole, sort of uh, foreground and background, something happening, and a lot of it's people kind of still believe that. But this process is also the basis of development legal form, according to Pashkanis, the development of the abstraction, the juridic subject, the reasonable man in law, the reasonable person, what is uh, a legal subject zero in that sense, someone who, there's some sort of idealizing of the legal subject, and notions of formal equality have their origins in the process of the exchange of commodities. The commodity exchangers enter the marketplace is inherently different from others. That is, the different, interests, wants, needs, etc. They're similar to the notion of use value, reflecting inherent differences. But two inherently different commodity exchangers enter an exchange situation in a definite relationship. This is that moment we've been talking about. That is the movement from one to another. This reflected at scale in the idea of turnover. Remember, we talked about turnover before. The turnover is not things, but rather the process. At the exact moment of exchange, three specific phenomenal forms appear. First, the two commodity owners enter a relationship of equality. Each recognizes the other as an equal in the very moment of exchange, even as there are inherent differences between the two. And at the moment of exchange, there is equivalence. Now, the point is, of course, that moment is fleeting. I think it's really important to remember that. Second, at this moment, there's also recognition. Remember, we were talking about that guy, the guy who introduces Higginbottom, that he has a bunch of things that he's written in political theory on the idea of recognition and recognizing, as opposed to believing representation. I would assert that's probably the difference. I'm not sure, but recognition of free will. Each of the parties sees the other as freely exchanging a commodity. So you believe that, this is a fair deal, fair trade. Finally, each recognizes the other as a rightful owner of the commodity that is being exchanged. This is that whole question of acknowledging property rights, so no one is stealing from anyone else. The constant exchange of commodities in the marketplace produces these three phenomenal forms: the notion of equality, free will, and the proprietorship interests. So there are these three elements. The idea of the bearer of rights develops out of this instance, and lawyers have provided idealized expression for these emergent forms. The juridic subject, as the bearer of these abstract rights, is now similar to the notion of exchange value. A person has been transformed into the reasonable man in law equivalent to other juridic subjects. Note here, of course, that women under the right wing would not be the same reasonable person in law, that they're not equivalent, that they are, chattel property in some current Republicans' beliefs. That they are, in fact, just vessels for child production, and they've represented certain attitudes about this. Women should carry the product of rape to term. Is a clear decision about that. That is, that someone else, the reasonable man in law, can determine what the unreasonable woman in law should be doing with their body. As Pashkanis has said, the legal subject assumes the significance of a mathematical point, a center in which a certain sum of rights is concentrated. The equivalence principle derived from capital logic is thereafter elevated to the heavens as a sacred right incorporated in many emerging constitutions that resulted from social transformations, the Declaration of Independence, Declaration of Rights of Man, blah, 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 blah. In sum, just as the commodity was transformed from use value to exchange value, so too is the person. Differences have been brought under the relationship of equivalence. Pushed away from consciousness is not only the unique and idiosyncratic, but also the historical production of the commodity and the person, along with the abstract development of law and the juridic subject. There appeared the need for formalistic contracts. For Pashukanis, in the logical system of legal concepts, the contract is only one of the forms of transaction in general. That is one of the methods of concrete expression of the will with whose aid the subject acts upon the legal sphere around him. Outside contract, he continues, the very concepts of subject and will exist only as lifeless abstractions in the legal sense. So you can see how certain ideas that we would normally think is quite important, life, liberty, blah, 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 can become abstract. In the U.S. Constitution, the equivalence principle can be found in the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, which argues that equally situated should be equally treated. Now, we know that this is problematic, and as I said, the right wing would truly like to eliminate the 14th Amendment. The juridic subject becomes a universal equivalent. Law finds its own legitimation principle within the logic of equivalent exchange, and the rule of law is elevated to the heavens. Both rich and poor are brought within its purview and formally equal before the law. So by bringing diverse subjects under a similar measure, many critics in the 1980s, following Pashukanis' logic, argued that the result was repressive formalism. And this had been already anticipated much earlier in the work of Max Weber, the idea that, sort of iron cage sort of stuff. In other words, at some moment, it becomes absolutized, whatever. Pashukanis' insights in the development of the legal form outlined in 1924 were subsequently questioned. He was to make some changes, but his essential position concerning the homology between the legal form and the commodity form remained intact to the end. Additionally, Pashukanis argued that the commodity exchange must be altered if these fetishisms were to be transformed, and that only in the higher forms of communism would the need for state law and the juridic subject disappear. So even within the transformation of capitalism to socialism and then to communism, there's this transitional period. During the transitional period, he wrote, human relationships will for a time involuntarily be limited by the narrow horizons of bourgeois law. You could argue that's kind of where we are right now, and it's sliding backward. Desirable, therefore, following Marx and Lenin, was the movement towards the higher forms. But it was this very question that was strongly debated during the transitional period of the dictatorship of the proletariat, especially during the creative and fertile years between 1917 and 1937, what was to become of Soviet law during this period? And needless to say, this is a problematic period, right? This is the death of Lenin, the rise of Stalin, purges, paranoia, attacks by white Russians, all kinds of crazy crap. And then, of course, there was a global economic collapse and all those other things. So, and this is not to be an apologist about this, but this is why it's still necessary to read about Stalin, just simply to know, sort of, well, what were these excesses and why, in fact, was Soviet law ignored, and ultimately, as we know from in 1937, putting people like Pashukanis to death, part of that. So, this is these are important kinds of questions. So there are articles, I've added some other things. So this is a Marxist left review, commodity exchanges, 9/10 of the law. And, the idea is that, what good things were engaged. I think Pashukanis gives us a sense that you can actually sort of apply some of these same ideas about what constitutes exchange value, use value, the concept of markets, whatever. and to note that there is some transformation occurring that is no different than the other problems of Marxism itself. That is the transformation problem, the organic composition of capital, etc. And I added this one little, it's kind of an interesting little article on the interplay of class production and sustainable development in international environmental law through the lens of Evgeny Pashakanas's commodity theory. Now, I know that's a big deal there, but it is, I think, possible to look, because in international law and international trade, as you know, whatever, you can see that some of these things are at work. That is, that this is probably the area that you need to sort of concentrate on, because a lot of international law contains these political economic problems that are used in various and sundry ways. So I hope that you can appreciate that essentially, and without saying that Trump is a mercantilist necessarily, but the ideas of trade wars, et cetera, are clearly pre-modern concepts in some ways. They're ways that don't rely, that on the one hand, they emphasize negotiation, but they also are ignorant in the question, as Trump still is, of the where are the costs located in the imposition of tariff rules. As amusing as they are, and as they are as important as they are to short-term investor prosperity, in the big picture, in a global sense, in like international environmental law, such ideas are incredibly stupid. So anyway, I've yacked sufficiently. Perhaps you have questions. I hope you do. Let's look at the chat. Pro-life, anti-choice rapists would be good parents. That's a really interesting question. Orange, oranges, not origins. Yes. Mental copulation. I guess we're all just preparing for Trump's. You really are going to show this, right? Trump and Musk. I don't know. Two jerks in a circle. Let's put it that way. Questions, comments, brickbats.
Yeah, I was curious. One of these, like, is there an example of what this legal entity or subject is? You know, is this like a jury member or something, or just one of us in society?
One of us in society. But the
Okay.
premise of the jury system is a kind of optimizing of that, right? That you should be judged by a jury of your peers. So there is some presumption that the 12 who are chosen, you know, whatever, at random, they're not really chosen at random. Speaking of the fact that I almost wound up, you know, I had to do jury duty today, or show up for jury duty. You know, there is a kind of idealized juridical subject, yeah? And yet that's constantly violated, right? Like voting rights. Voting rights are probably a better example of that inequity, yes? Rationalizations about voter suppression, for example, presume that some people don't deserve the right to vote, have greater rights than others, or some have lesser rights than others. You didn't maintain your registration properly, therefore we wipe you off the rolls. Yeah. Hello? Hello?
If corporations are people, can they vote?
That's the other side of that, right? is to give them certain juridical subject rights, to give them a certain power. Their position in the market, in other words, operates as a larger institutional force. And you know, it weighs against certain presumptions about what the greater good is, right? It's the corporation's greater good and not the people's greater good.
Well, so Anne, that's why I wonder if the right wing would want to overturn the 14th Amendment, since they've used that to justify corporate personhood.
Oh, indeed. Well, these are just manipulations. These are just manipulations. If they wiped it out, they wouldn't have to construct an argument about corporations as people. They would just, there wouldn't be any protection. Let's put it this way. There wouldn't be any protections of individuals in that context. Therefore, the corporations don't need to have the rights of individuals, because individuals would have fewer rights in the aggregate. There would be no protections at all in terms of due process or whatever. It's a deregulatory move. You sort of see where I'm.
Well, wouldn't they not want to do that, because they are giving corporations the protections of the Constitution? They're giving them constitutional rights, which puts essentially makes them immune from democratic regulation.
Right, and subordinates other people's rights. But if you just eliminated the whole thing in general, I think it's just an intermediate move, let's just put it that way, to protect the corporate. You could protect it in other ways, and it wouldn't be a 14th Amendment, right?
Can we say, instead of removing it in general, can we say removing it in toto?
Yeah, if you like those little dogs that go, yeah.
Hey, go to Kansas or wherever they're going.
Norfolk Terriers, and that's the measure. It's an intermediate move to give corporations that kind of power, but the fact is they have that power anyway. It's just other means. It's not leveling it with humans. It's actually giving it more power. The inequity is fairly obvious, right? Corporation is clearly wealthier than any one individual, so it is simply concretizing that difference. But it's only one step. I think that whatever is going to overturn, and this is the important point, is what will overturn Citizens United, or what kind of, if we were going to do this just like Dobbs overturns Roe, what kind of test case would you use to do that? Probably have to use a ecological or environmental one, I would say.
To do what?
To overturn Citizens United.
Oh. Well, the court could do it tomorrow if they wanted to.
Oh, yeah.
They just wrongly decided.
Yes.
Case.
Yes, indeed. Just like
Roe versus Wade.
Yeah. We're in this weird place, and it's sad that it has to rely on the whatever inequalities or inequities of the legislature and the executive system that allowed Trump to get away with 3 appointees.
So if you want to overturn Citizens United, does it really matter what case or argument you have? Doesn't the makeup of the court decide it? So isn't that what you
Well,
need?
that's one way to argue it. You can argue it from the point of view that it is all simply about judges. That is a critical legal theory actually addresses that question. Is that, well, it 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 depends on which judge you get, I guess, to look at it kind of in a purely sociological point of view. And that's a really cynical way of looking at it. It would be much better if we had something, a much more widely democratically agreed upon principles, as opposed to the arbitrariness of venue or the choice of judge, right?
So, but it's always going to be the judge because they're people. So unless we can move into the era where AI judges us impartially and logically and fairly, it's always going to be about the human judge.
Indeed. I'm waiting. There's probably articles on AI law, but I don't even want to go there. But yeah. It's all very depressing, indeed. Right?
AI Law, isn't that a new series coming this fall on NBC?
Coming this fall, AI law.
Dun, 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 dun,
Dun,
dun.
dun. Oh man.
But you see, what you have to do is just the way the other side enjoys it, even if it's ill-gotten wins, it's still a win. You can't get hung up on being rational or having a good foundation for your argument. You just have to go with winning. Remember what he said. We're going to be winning so much, we're going to get tired of winning.
Oh, I am tired of it.
Winning bigly. Winning bigly.
Exactly.
Ben Wig.
It's not my fault I didn't read the word whining properly on the teleprompter. We're going to be whining. Oh, the woke brigade. Whining, whining, whining. I sound a bit like a deviant because I'm whispering. I'm not deviant, I'm just whispering. I'm in the realm of the hedgehog.
Are there hedgehogs out there?
I hear rutting, but I can't see any of them. But they're rutting. Rut, rut.
They like
I
privacy for their rut.
I did want to compliment Professor Ann on bringing up Cardassian justice system, and also take this opportunity to wish you all a happy Federation Day.
Oh man!
Which celebrates the creation of the United Federation of Planets in the year 2161.
You fucking assholes.
So, if you could make sure to eat your vegetables so you're able to see it in 137 years.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Can I ask a question about star date years?
Yes, it's very easy to answer, but go ahead.
It is? Oh,
Yeah.
because in that movie, it was like the year 6000 something or other, right?
Oh no, so star dates don't equate to our calendar year or our system of measuring
Oh, okay.
time.
So
So
what does it mean?
well, because there's so much Star Trek and no one seems to have taken the time to figure out what it means. It's pretty arbitrary.
Oh,
Sorry to
Although
disappoint
I
you.
thought
John's
it meant that it was like 4,000 years in the future.
No, no, no. Star Trek takes place in the, well, I mean, depends which era of Star Trek you're talking about, but the
Yeah.
23rd century.
Oh,
John's determined his
well,
own formula for star date and lives
23rd
to that date.
century. So it's
Yeah.
like in 2,000 years. But the thing is, then it's very hard. Like when
No,
before
200 years.
19
200 years.
before 900, whatever, before 1984, we were all waiting for 1984.
Yes. And we got it
Yeah, and
to a
so it
degree.
didn't really happen exactly as, like in the book,
Yeah.
but we won't be able to do that with Star Trek. I mean, people
What?
like in a whatever 100 years, they're not going to be, say, oh, this day is approaching.
They won't?
I don't
Oh,
know.
I
Are
think,
they going to be
I think,
able to figure it out
yeah, I
in
think
the
she means
actual?
there's not an actual Earth date that is
Oh, I see.
associated
No,
with anything in Star Trek.
no, we do know the Earth dates of certain events in Federation history. And are you writing this down, Lane? Um, but it doesn't equate well to the star date system.
Well, it doesn't
So
make sense, but that's okay because most of it really doesn't make sense anyway, right?
no, no, no. It makes almost perfect sense
Ah, if you say
in my
so.
brain. Yeah.
So, John, if you would, I think we can shut off the YouTube if you don't mind.
Oh, I didn't realize we were still on YouTube. Okay, I hope everyone enjoyed that
Yeah,
little
we're still
lecture.
yammering on you. We're still yammering on YouTube.
Okay, Joe, did you say Joe or me? Because I don't know how to do it.
No, John Hayes is the
Oh,
host. I'm
John
not sure whether
Hayes. Oh,
John
I
Hayes, you
just
want to
use
get?
this opportunity to say hello to my fans on YouTube worldwide.
I don't even see John here. Oh, there he is.
Hello, fan.
John, are you there?
He stepped away.
Give host back to somebody. Or Joe, you want to reclaim host, please? Because I have no status as usual.
That's okay. You have status with us.
that's for sure.
But until then, you can keep arguing about Star Trek.
Yes, yeah. Yeah.
That makes excellent content for YouTube, right?
Exactly.
Christ.
It might work to bring in a new audience. Who knows?
Well, we could talk about the difference in the legal systems, right?
Oh,
I
Mhm.
mean that since we're going to be watching the next generation, it becomes more juridical. There's a lot more juridical stuff in it.
That
Prime
that is true.
directive
Yeah.
and shit like that.
Hmm.
I think we should leave the next generation to the next generation. I mean, it's only fair. It's only fair. We'll just set it out there.
Well, Lane, actually, because it came on the air in '87, it is the next generation now.
I mean, our next generation. So when your spawn take over this collective.
Your spawn.
Nice.
When they emerge from their underground lair.
From their pupae.
Well, okay, Hayes is not there. I don't know, co-host. Co-host, do you have power to do anything about this? I'm not sure whether you do.
No.
How do you
No,
how do you figure
co-host
it out?
can't do it.
All right, well, let me leave and come back and see if I can.
Reclaim.
So we can't say the F word until she gets this sorted out.
What F word is that, John?
Mm,
Oh,
What's the difference? People say it on YouTube, and
Yeah.
this isn't getting monetized anyway. So how does it matter?
and nobody's looking at it ever.
Well, we want to
we-
monetize this.
We have
But-
no
Well,
friends.
but it doesn't
We
matter
want to
right
start
now
selling
today.
merch.
Fuck,
Yeah,
fuck,
it's-
fuck.
It's a shorthand for like, hey, you're online, don't dox yourself, don't,
Yeah.
Well, I don't curse a lot, so I don't care anyway. But I just don't think it matters.
I curse an awful lot. I tone it down
Do-
for you lot.
Do they say the F word on YouTube?
They say all kinds of things.
Fucking hell, yeah.
I've never
Yeah.
heard cursing on YouTube ever.
No, never.
Well, it's a lovely night tonight, so I'm watching shooting stars booting around. Lovely.
I saw that there was Northern Lights not that far from here, like in the
Yes.
Hudson Valley. I was
Mhm.
shocked. It was somebody went to the Ashokan Reservoir and had pictures of Northern Lights over there.
We had them last
Really?
night. I missed them.
Near Woodstock?
They went to look at the meteor showers, and there.
That was the
Look,
the
it was
Leonid meteor
on
shower.
the internet, so it could be a lie, but it was like somebody on my Facebook thing that I think is a real person, and they went and took pictures of it. So
Let's see, Northern Lights. What is it? Dutchess County. What's the county? Dutchess County.
it would be Ulster.
Ulster County.
Ulster County.
Oh, you're right. Hudson Valley, it says here, Northern Lights, surprise. From the Wolf, 97.7, 97.3, and 105.5. The Wolf, Hudson Valley's
So
new country. There's
you could have
pictures.
driven right over there. You could have seen it.
Yeah, that would have been cool. Yeah, look at that. So that must be
I don't-
so there must have been some solar activity. Not
Yeah.
a coronal mass,
Always.
not a coronal mass ejection, but something sub-coronal mass ejection, because that's what caused
Whatever. We don't
all the
understand
solar
that stuff
wind.
anyway. It's okay.
Well, it's important to understand it.
I don't
It
want to
is.
understand. I just want to believe.
Yeah.
It's charged particles that are released from the sun that come towards us, and thanks to our magnetosphere, magnetosphere acts like if you imagine a giant, take a slinky and wrap it around in a circle, and imagine all those lines, and hold it vertically so that the lines are going up and down. That's the lines of our magnetosphere, and they deflect all this potentially harmful solar radiation that comes at us.
Yes, yes.
Okay,